You call the book Conspirator, and you say interesting things in the book about what konspiracja in Russian actually means, and it's not quite exactly the same as being a conspirator. So can you say what, because that sort of seemed to me to encapsulate a lot about his life in exile.
Well, konspiracja was Lenin's watchword. In Russian, the word konspiracja means more secrecy, stealth, than actual conspiracy. But it was the word he kept repeating over and over and over again in all these endless directives and missives and letters from abroad, that there must be tighter konspiracja, there must be greater secrecy, there must be very carefully controlled closed cells, small numbers of people, utterly loyal to each other, who often didn't know the names of people beyond their tight-knit cell. This was the thing that obsessed Lenin wherever he went: secrecy, watching his back, looking for double agents, looking for traitors. In a way, one of the things I wanted to try and capture in that, the use of that word, konspiracja, secrecy, little men conspiring in back rooms in Geneva or wherever, was something of this whole febrile world of the Russian Revolutionary abroad that Conrad, I think, captured so brilliantly in Under Western Eyes, and also in The Secret Agent. It was a very, very fervent and querulous and insecure world of men literally sitting up all night, smoking roll-ups and drinking too much tea, and it all got very intense and obsessional.
When does it become apparent that Lenin sees himself as a leader rather than simply a contributor?
He has the arrogance and the self-belief and the drive right from day one to be a leading voice in the revolutionary movement abroad, but it really becomes apparent during the 1902-3 period in London, and the first big split in the party that becomes apparent at that Congress that was held in London in secret in 1903, when you get the first sign of a split between Lenin's Bolsheviks and Martos Mensheviks. Lenin, from then onwards, from 1903 onwards, through every single conference of the RSDLP, powerhoused his way through hectoring and arguing and bullying for his point of view. He was no good at accepting compromises. He would not listen to the other person's point of view. It was a real matter of steamrolling his own beliefs through. I think that is what it kept him going, this sense that he had to do it. He had to do it alone. He couldn't trust or delegate to anyone else. It was down to him to see it happen, to make it happen.
Tell me about the challenges of tracking his movements. He changed address so many times, he changed name. Tracking him down must have been one of the pleasures, but also the stumbling blocks of this project.
Well, Lenin used something like 100 varying aliases and variations of initials and names, and it wasn't till 1904 he really settled on the pseudonym Lenin, although he wasn't really effectively known very well abroad under that name until a bit later, by 1907. But within the movement, he often signed himself Ulyanov, and that was his real name. But when he arrived in London on a false passport, he appeared as this sort of German-sounding Dr. Richter. But he used endless aliases and different passports in his constant game of cat and mouse to keep the Russian secret police at bay. I did have a fairly clear idea of which persona he was living under in which place. William Fry was another name that he used in Finland. So I had a pretty good idea of who I was looking for in each country when I got there.
And you mentioned Finland and Poland earlier as places where you were particularly looking for traces of him. What kind of things did you discover?
I felt that the only way I could tell those two parts of the story was actually go there on the ground and seek Lenin out, because there wasn't really enough in the sources, and I didn't have the languages. So I was very, very fortunate in the case of Finland. I contacted the only surviving Lenin museum in the world, i.e. full-time Lenin museum, which is a little museum in Tampere in Finland. Incredibly kind and helpful staff there, who I contacted and said, look, I want to come over and trace Lenin's escape out of Finland. That this is about the most dramatic thing that happened during his exile. He actually did have to get out quick at Christmas 1907 out of Finland, and he did it by going down the southwest archipelago, this little succession of tiny islands and skerries. And I wanted to follow that journey. But I thought, how on earth am I going to do it with no finish? There's no public transport. Can't do it on a bicycle. I wouldn't feel very safe. And so I sort of threw myself on the mercy of the Lenin Museum, who were incredibly kind. I asked their advice and they said, no problem, we'll take you. We will drive you. So the director of the Lenin Museum and his colleague drove me all the way down the southwest peninsula, and I saw the places where Lenin stopped off, and I got a very strong visual sense, particularly of the Ofstiaden Sound, which is this enormous stretch of water 2 miles across that Lenin crossed at dead of night when it was frozen solid, and he crossed it on the ice and nearly fell in. It was a very dramatic moment in his story. So that was a wonderful way of reliving the story that I could never have written. So I couldn't have written that in the same way if I hadn't been there. Because the awful thing is, the Soviet hagiographers, as always, minimized the role of all and any foreign nationals in looking after Lenin in exile. So the Finns get an odd mention, but they don't get credit where due. I mean, without them, I'm quite certain that Lenin would have been caught by the Okhrana in 1907. And, history might have been quite different.
The other group of people whom you mention as not getting their due are women. The women in the history of the Bolshevik movement, their role has been downplayed, hasn't it?
Well, I wouldn't even say it's been downplayed, it's just been ignored. And the trouble is, these women were so loyal, so dedicated, so self-effacing, that very little of their story has come through to us. I was very glad in the book to be able to at least tell the story of one or two of them, women like Feodosia Drabkina in St. Petersburg, who would go around with parts of rifles disassembled under her dress or smuggling bombs under her clothes, taking her 3-year-old daughter with her as cover. These women took enormous risks. And of course, the women in Lenin's immediate family, Nadia, was an incredibly dedicated worker in the Russian underground and had tabs on all the underground workers across Europe, took enormous risks. Inessa Armand, who did have an affair with Lenin, went back and forth into Russia on Lenin's behalf, and got arrested and spent time in jail. The only women really who've had any mention are Nadia and Inessa, but there are an awful lot of other women. And it was only going back into St. Petersburg, into the museum there, that I found some evidence on them, which I managed to bring back in Russian and use in the book.
You say in the preface that perhaps Lenin isn't a natural choice for someone like you, a woman, a feminist. I mean, what was it like spending so much time with this man? I mean, he's a very difficult man, A, to get to know, and B, to like, I would imagine.
Well, you see, it was a wonderful challenge, because what I wanted to know about Lenin was the complete obverse. People have complained there's not enough politics in the book. I set out deliberately not to write a political book. I wanted, in a way, to write the domestic life of Lenin. I wanted to know what he ate, where he lived, what kind of rooms, what kind of habitation did he and Nadia have? How did they get on living in close confinement, actually, for a lot of that time, with her mother-in-law trailed round Europe with them. How did they get on with these very incestuous revolutionary circles abroad? As I've said earlier, Lenin quarrelled with almost everyone. It was a very different life, and I wanted to understand that, because the standard books on Lenin don't really talk about his personal life very much at all. I wanted to know more about Nadia. How did she cope with living with a monomaniac? It was fascinating, because I very quickly discovered that she totally suppressed her own needs and also neglected her own health quite considerably. She was very unwell. She had quite a serious thyroid condition that went undiagnosed and untreated for a long time. So these were the things I thought, this is the only opportunity, in a way. By writing about Lenin, I can say something about the women who contributed to his well-being in exile, his safety, his security, because one thing I am absolutely convinced of is, without Nadia, he would have driven himself to such complete physical and mental collapse, he might never have reached 1917. So the women, although in themselves are not key players, they are crucial because of the fantastically important emotional and physical a practical backup that they gave him during those long years in exile.